Thanks for coming. My name is Arnulf Becker-Lorca. I'm chair in international law. I'm here on behalf of Sergio Puig, who is the new director of the Max Weber program. And we're all here to welcome Professor Philip Alston, who is giving the April Max Weber lecture. So I hope you enjoy. It's going to be roughly an hour. Before that, Julia will introduce Professor Alston, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Yes. Hello, everyone. It is a great pleasure to welcome Philip Alston as one of the Max Weber lecturers this month. Introducing Professor Alston properly would probably take the whole hour of this lecture, but just to mention a few of his roles. Primarily, Professor Alston is a professor at New York University Law School, but also he held many positions within the UN, such as the UN Special Rapporteur. And for those who are not familiar with the UN mandate holder system, it is kind of a big deal to be a UN Special Rapporteur because you're appointed by the UN Human Rights Council. So Professor Alston has been a UN Special Rapporteur twice. From 2014 to 2020, he was a special rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. And during that time, he produced several very important reports on the implications and the effects of privatization on the provision of basic services and basic human rights. Professor Alston has also been the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial executions, and also previously chairperson of the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And economic, social, and cultural rights has been also the focus of most of the Professor Alston's work. And I hope we can hear about it a bit more during today's lecture, and hopefully also see more scholarship coming out from this lecture. So I'll pass it on to you, Professor Alston.
Thank you, Julia. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think my greatest achievement, which Julia didn't mention, was to survive a period as head of the law department at the EUI 25 years or more ago. But it's very nice to be back. I've given my talk tonight the title of Can Human Rights Survive the Onslaught? The onslaught, of course, refers to the rising tide of authoritarianism in a great many countries around the world, but obviously with particular focus on what's happening right now in the United States. And forgive me if I pay too much attention to America, but that I think is warranted not only by the scale of developments in the US, but also by the likely imitation effect which those developments will have. We tend to see a great many countries following in the footsteps of the United States in terms of policies, and I suspect that this current phase will not be any different. So I'm going to talk about two things, really. The first is just is of more immediate interest, but also more ephemeral, and that is just how I see the relationship between the United States and the United Nations human rights machinery evolving in the short term. But more importantly, I want to provide a number of elements that I think are indispensable for the revival of the human rights enterprise, if I can call it that. So let me begin by looking at the response to what's happening more generally. As academics, we know that there is a strong background of critical thought about human rights. And many of the most prominent observers who come from Western nations, particularly the United States itself, have essentially given up on human rights. They have argued that human rights have been highly ineffectual, that they suck up all the oxygen, that they leave little room for the most important values, and therefore we should simply move on to some other conceptual framework. They don't, of course, specify what that framework is, which is a challenge, but I think we have to leave open the possibility that there will be a post-human rights world. That's certainly not my position. I hope that I'm not too much a captive of my own past, in the sense that obviously I'm heavily invested in what the United Nations has done and in the values underlying that human rights work, and I'm not easily going to be persuaded to abandon that. But I do want to, and I think you'll hear shortly, that I am very unhappy with the current state of human rights, not in the world. I think we should all be unhappy with that, but with the state of the human rights movement and with its capacity to respond to what I see as the principal challenges confronting us all. And so that will be the main focus in a sense. The response from most human rights groups so far has been a call to double down on existing approaches. In other words, we need to strengthen the status quo. We need to resist the challenges. We need to just do better what we've been doing for quite a long time now. And I don't think that that is going to get us very far. I think, in fact, that we do now need to undertake a critical evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of the status quo and draw conclusions from that. Obviously, I can't do it in the sort of detail that would be desirable, at least in the context of this lecture. But first of all, let me just focus on the immediate US challenge. Most American commentators have focused on the loss of American influence rather than on the impact on the broader international system. In other words, they are concerned in particular that American soft power, as it's called, will be greatly diminished. And it is true that the elimination of the US Agency for International Development, of the US Institute for Peace, of the Voice of America, and no doubt of most international educational exchanges will deal a blow to American soft power. But my sense is that that soft power has been waning in any event, and that those major sort of institutional manifestations of soft power have in any event been overtaken by new forms of social media and other forms of communication, which are more important than the traditional exchanges these days. That doesn't mean, of course, that American values won't continue to be projected. Indeed, they are in the world of social media, the world of influencers and so on is still very active. Obviously, Elon Musk in charge of X is overseeing a huge array of contributors to the global debate who represent the sort of conservative, even radical values that the current administration is espousing. And I don't think we will see any diminution of that. And in fact, it highlights the extent to which the events in the United States are likely to be promoted in a very positive light in a great many of the forums that the youth of today are most active. Clearly, in the United Nations context, the withdrawal of American support in terms of development and humanitarian assistance will open up new opportunities for China and Russia on a global scale. And I don't say that in a paranoid way. I say it as a matter of fact. China is very active, has been trying for a long time to promote its values, its approach to government, and in continuing to do that, will be left with less resistance and there will be fewer alternatives. Similarly, Russia, which has been remarkably active and remarkably successful in Africa, for example, will also profit from the withdrawal of the United States from a lot of engagement in these areas. The larger question, which has been raised by some commentators, is whether the United States might actually withdraw from the United Nations. Last month, a bill was presented to the Congress in both houses, which is called the Disengaging Entirely from the United Nations Debacle Act of 2025. Now, that ridiculous title is concocted in order to generate the acronym, which is the Defund Act of 2025. There's a certain irony there in terms of the defund the police movement, which came out of the killing of George Floyd and mobilized the progressive side of politics. So this particular defund initiative is to get the US out of the UN. It has very modest objectives, however. It would only terminate US membership of the UN and membership in any organ, specialized agency, commission, or other body affiliated with the UN. So in other words, comprehensive in terms of international organizations. It would forbid US contributions to the UN. It would forbid US participation in UN peacekeeping operations. And it would remove the privileges and immunities from UN officials and diplomats, which is another way of saying that the UN would no longer be able to operate in the United States, in New York. So far, happily, there's no obvious indication that this will actually happen. The Trump administration has appointed an ambassador to the UN, Elise Stefanik, who will be confirmed next month. She has cabinet status. She is very close to the president. And her concerns are to combat the evil growing influence of China, to advocate more strongly for Israel, and to reform peacekeeping. So her message is basically one of reform rather than of elimination. A new NGO has been set up, you'll be delighted to hear, which is called DOGE UN, Department of Government Efficiency for the UN. It's named after Elon Musk's dubious enterprise, and its goal is to restore the UN to its original purposes of peace, development, and human rights. This can be done by demanding full transparency and accountability, getting rid of bureaucratic bloat, waste, and inefficiencies, the fraudulent rallying cry of DOGE domestically in the US, ending all fraud and corruption, and interestingly, in terms of the Max Weber lecture, regaining member states' control of the UN from bureaucratic capture. The NGO says that the UN bureaucracy is a deep state that has co-opted management, administrative, and budgetary matters. As a result, it has made the UN a distressed property. The bankruptcy people have to come in when a property is distressed, lowered its value, and attracted a host of problems. But nonetheless, even if US responses to the UN are limited to pushing reforms, the prospect of very significant damage resulting from financial strangulation, if I can put it in that strong way, is quite serious. And other Western countries are showing no interest in picking up on the huge contribution that the US has made. And as Western European states begin to greatly expand their defense budgets, they have already started the process of significantly cutting foreign aid. So they would be most unlikely to be expanding their contributions to make up for the US departure from these bodies. The Human Rights Council, which is the main UN human rights organ, the Trump administration has withdrawn again. It did so once before. I don't want to take any of the credit or blame for that withdrawal, but it did come in the week before the United States was supposed to answer a detailed report that I had made on poverty in the United States. And there were subsequently documents leaked that linked my report to the push to withdraw. I'm sure it was a very minor element. It has to be said that the previous withdrawal didn't have a great impact. The United States is still able to speak out. It's still able to participate if it wishes to. And it hasn't yet announced that it will follow in the footsteps of a country that I'm sure it admires greatly, which has recently announced that it will comprehensively disengage from the Human Rights Council. That country is Nicaragua, which is run by the dictatorship of the Ortegas. The US will, however, probably not participate in the main monitoring mechanisms like the Universal Periodic Review, and almost certainly won't report to the different treaty bodies, I would expect, which they're required to do as a result of the treaties they've ratified. Instead, I think the US will continue to engage, and we saw an example of this earlier this month. The UN Commission on the Status of Women met. The United States was actively present. They affirmed their commitment to the protection of women and girls, to the defense of their rights and their empowerment, but added that the United States will no longer promote radical ideologies that replace women with men in spaces and opportunities designed for women, and that it would not devastate families by indoctrinating our sons and daughters to begin war with their own bodies. At the same session, it co-sponsored what's called a side event on the gender ideology assault on women and the family. So in other words, the expectation is that the US will be actively engaged in UN bodies in promoting the new administration's agenda, which has not only comprehensively attacked reproductive rights, but also objected to the use of the word gender and shown great hesitation to use the term women's rights in the past. I think this will obviously have a significant impact, but my hope is that the basic system will remain intact. The good news is that the UN is an elephant in the sense that it's very hard to move it quickly, or a ship, if you like, very hard to turn it around quickly. And so even concerted efforts by the US are not likely to be able to seriously disrupt the human rights machinery, even if it is significantly lacking in funding. One of the big questions that will arise is whether the Human Rights Council should investigate the situation in the United States. I think if we were applying the standard that is used in relation to other countries, there would be no doubt that developments relating to freedom of speech and assembly, non-discrimination, due process, and various other human rights standards that have already occurred would warrant an investigation. But the setting up of a commission of inquiry to examine any one of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council would be a huge step. China managed to avoid it in relation to the situation in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, and the United States would no doubt be equally determined to avoid it. There are, however, precedents where groups of special rapporteurs, these independent experts, have actually taken it upon themselves to report on particularly problematic situations, including Guantanamo Bay in past years. And so there would be an option there for an independent initiative to actually put the United States under scrutiny in the UN Human Rights Council. Okay, now I want to move on to the more important part of the presentation, which is looking to the future evolution of the overall human rights system. In doing that, I want to draw attention to two vital background elements which set the scene in a sense for what I consider to be the new elements that are required. Those background elements, and I'm not going to go into them in any detail, I apologize for that. The first is simply the proposition that what we are seeing around the world is discontent on the part of voters who feel that the transformation of the global economy into a neoliberal model has systematically privileged the wealthy and the powerful, while generating ever greater precariousness for the bulk of the working population. This is a pretty long, well-established theme. It relates also to the disabling of politics, long analyzed by people like Wolfgang Streeck and others. The argument that once the power is transferred over to economic actors who are independent of the state, to the private sector, to international organizations like the International Monetary Fund and others, then local democracy loses most of its salience, because you can vote, you can demonstrate, you can do what you goddamn like, but you're not going to be able to affect economic policy because that's no longer controlled by the government. And so the replacement for that is the sort of cultural and nationalist themes that tend these days to dominate many elections, as we saw in the United States. But of course, that doesn't address in any way the deeper discontents. And as I'll explain in a minute, I would describe those discontents from a human rights point of view as involving the denial of economic and social human rights. The second element that I want to introduce, just by way of starting the discussion, relates to the way in which we see what's happening in the United States right now. And I hope I'm not oversimplifying, but I disagree with the way in which what's happening has been presented by most commentators. A group of US law professors, for example, recently described the developments as an authoritarian assault on institutions central to free speech and self-government, from universities to the media to the bar. And they talk about it in terms of a constitutional crisis. Indeed, most critics look at this as an assault on democracy and the rule of law. There's no question that those things are happening. And I think that the US is descending fairly quickly into authoritarianism. But what I see when I look at what is going on is not what has been characterized by other commentators as chaotic, arbitrary, or disorganized policies that follow the whim of President Trump or of Elon Musk, but rather a very disciplined and carefully thought through application of the agenda that was laid out by the Heritage Foundation in 920 pages of Agenda 25, which is now more than a couple of years old and has been there for all of us to see. The measures are, many of the measures are presented as ways to attack anti-Semitism or to root out fraud and corruption. In my view, both of those pretexts are completely phony. They have nothing to do with what's actually going on. Instead, what I see is one simple development. I'm sorry, this is probably too simplistic. And that is the wholesale privatization of most government functions, designed to open up huge opportunities for the private sector, combined with the elimination or incapacitation of all agencies responsible for monitoring or regulating both governmental and private sector conduct in governing and in the marketplace, the elimination of tax, regulatory, and other constraints that reduce the ability of individuals to accumulate massive fortunes despite the effect of greatly increasing societal inequality. And finally, the enabling of the tech industry, aided by the hype around artificial intelligence. And the tech industry is already moving in full force into almost all of the areas that the government is vacating. Tech provides the pretext as well, because we don't need all these officials, we don't need all these agencies, because these functions can be performed by artificial intelligence. That's the sort of thinking that motivates a lot of this. And it also is an accurate reflection of the arrogance of big tech, which actually believes that it can be a replacement for the many different agencies and functions that are being eliminated. I think we can take SpaceX as an example. SpaceX has become, astonishingly in a way, the de facto space agency of the United States. You don't hear about NASA anymore. But what we do know is that the constraints that Elon Musk was chafing under from several different regulatory agencies have been eliminated, because those agencies have either been eliminated or incapacitated. The elimination of the Department of Education can be seen as another way of accelerating the privatization of education in the United States. The whole voucher system and so on. One of the main constraints on state government action in simply privatizing all education were the various federal requirements. Those are now largely gone. And finally, I guess weakening government agencies across a multitude of issue areas. The list is endless, but humanitarian aid, agriculture, health services, scientific research, meteorology, national parks. None of these things are going to disappear. They're all going to be picked up by the private sector immediately because they are functions that need to be performed. The government needs them performed. The people need them performed. They haven't simply been eliminated. They have been handed over de facto to the private sector. I want to just mention one example. I shouldn't spend too much time on privatization, but I think it is the main way of understanding what's going on, in fact. A delicious document issued by Wells Fargo Bank a couple of weeks ago, anticipating the privatization of the US Postal Service. And it's a classic playbook for privatizing the economy. What they propose is to immediately divide the US Postal Service up into letter delivery and parcel delivery. Letter delivery is a loser. Letter delivery has the universal service obligation. You've got to deliver to every address in the United States. You have limitations on what you can charge because the public wants to be able to get its letters for less than $20 a letter. And so that is a loss maker. But it has been subsidized by the parcel service, which, thanks to Amazon and others, has been thriving. So the letter function would be retained by the US government. The parcel function would be put up for sale. And the prices that would be anticipated would be as much as 140% higher than existing prices. That's what Wells Fargo estimates. They say that the really good news about that is that UPS and FedEx would be able to charge much more and would make much higher profits. One of the main problems with UPS, as with all public sector operations, is they have a large pension liability. But on the other, in other words, all of the people who have worked for the post office in the past or who are there now are owed pensions. But that is offset to some extent by the fact that the office space and other assets of the Postal Service are $85 billion worth, according to Wells Fargo. So how do you then accommodate this? It's easy. You put all of the pension obligations onto the US government. They stay there. The privatized entity, on the other hand, will benefit from the sale of the or repurposing of the $85 billion worth of real estate and other assets, which can then be used by the new parcel delivery company. Wells Fargo talks about this as a huge opportunity, great investment, etc. And it is a classic illustration of the way in which privatization works. We're going to see similar developments in relation to a whole range of health services. We're seeing them already, bizarrely, because of the constituency, in relation to Veterans Affairs. That department is being cut very significantly. And there, again, veterans are not going to die overnight, even if the government would wish they might. Veterans are going to need a lot of the services. Don't worry, private sector will step in. It's just that the difference is you're going to pay veteran, not the government. The confirmation hearings for the head of Social Security Administration took place yesterday. He was asked, do you plan to privatize Social Security? He said, no, I promise. never even occurred to me. At the same time, Elizabeth Warren submitted a letter to him outlining the various steps that have already been taken, which will serve to effectively undermine a lot of aspects of Social Security. The sort of standard tricks to ensure that you can't get Social Security without official ID. That if you can't get that official ID, you have to go to a government office. The government offices that you can go to are being closed down, and they're only in a smaller number of locations, and those sorts of things. So there will be a significant privatization there as well. So I just wanted to say that the backdrop against which I now move to look at what I think are the key things that need to be done is the failure to address the undermining of the economic and social security of the bulk of the population of the United States and increasingly in other countries, and the radical privatization of the economy that Trump is pursuing. So these are my elements for restoring the legitimacy and vitality of human rights. I have to say that some of these might come as a surprise to some of you, but anyone who knows my work will not be at all surprised, because these are unfortunately themes that I have long been rattling on about, but as a very small minority within the human rights area. So the first thing that needs to be done is to restore the normative integrity of the concept of human rights. The foundational document of today's international human rights regime is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from 1948. And all the subsequent treaties and so on are based upon that foundation. Economic, social, and cultural rights were an integral part of the package that was negotiated in 1948. And I just want to read to you a quote from E.H. Carr, who is a famous international relations theorist, but also someone who was involved in the broader process of drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He wrote immediately after the adoption of the Declaration, it's a long quote, "It will seem clear to many that the addition of social and economic rights to the political rights which appeared all important to the revolutionaries of the 18th century has been the most signal and unmistakable advance in the conception of the rights of man registered in recent times. This has been the natural and necessary corollary of the extension of the functions of the state from narrowly defined sphere of classic liberal democracy to those social and economic preoccupations which have become the primary concern of the modern legislator and administrator. The scope of human rights has widened with the scope of government. It's no more possible to return to the purely political 18th century conception than to restore the laissez-faire state." He was wrong. Governments led by the United States and the United Kingdom moved immediately after the adoption of the Universal Declaration to downgrade and, as far as possible, eliminate economic and social rights. They started the process in 1950 by saying, well, we need to have two major treaties, two covenants, because these rights are quite different. And the arrangements for each were different and the obligations were different and so on. That was just the start of the process. And the inclusion of social rights was immediately criticized by the early neoliberals, with Friedrich Hayek in particular launching a big assault on economic and social rights, saying the UN had lost its way, didn't understand what rights were really all about. And ironically, the main founder of Human Rights Watch, Aryeh Nair, used exactly the same language as Hayek to reject economic and social rights. He said that they were only viable or feasible in a totalitarian society. And so Human Rights Watch, as one of the leaders of Western-driven human rights advocacy organizations, rejected economic and social rights and projected and basically continues to project an understanding of human rights which just cuts in half the body that was originally constructed, as though you could do that. In other words, yes, they're divisible. Yes, the package was not really a package. We can just separate them out. One of the justifications given by Aryeh Nair, in fact, was that in any event, economic and social rights were just the creation of the Soviet Union. And this was a reflection of their dominance in the UN context. The technical term for that assessment is bullshit. It's complete nonsense. The economic and social rights provisions in the Universal Declaration actually and ironically owe more than anyone else, or are owed more than anyone else, to the initiatives of Franklin D. Roosevelt during World War II. He talked about an economic Bill of Rights for the United States in 1944. And all of the ideas that he and his advisors developed in relation to this economic Bill of Rights for the United States were then presented to the UN drafting group by the American Law Institute. And again, bizarrely, they were adopted almost in their entirety. Now, of course, the Soviet Union and its supporters were very active in promoting economic and social rights, a somewhat different conception, to say the least, but nonetheless, they were active. Latin American countries were heavily focused on economic and social rights. And of course, most of Western Europe was sympathetic as the social democracy evolved. So the inclusion of economic and social rights at that time reflected a genuine consensus across regions, across ideologies. And the argument that was put forward was that this really was a package, that you can't separate it out, that civil and political rights do not have the same meaning in a society where there are no economic and social rights, and vice versa. But in fact, what we have done since 1950 is to pursue a conception of human rights which pays almost no attention to economic and social rights. And the relevance of that is what I said earlier, that it means, therefore, you have no basis on which to address the principal discontents of so many voters in so many countries, because there's no such thing as economic and social rights. If you're protected from not being hit, then you enjoy your human rights. If you're protected from not being arbitrarily locked up, you've got your human rights. So shut up about access to education, about healthcare, about some sort of social security, etc. They are not rights, and I don't want to hear about them. That's essentially where we are at. And as I mentioned earlier, the principal international human rights groups have supported strongly this approach. Human Rights Watch was never prepared to argue in favor of economic and social rights. Amnesty International has done a terrible job, even though in recent years they have changed their formal discourse, but they don't take economic and social rights seriously. And if you have any friends who think they work on human rights or are concerned about human rights, ask them what the main rights are. And you know what you're going to get. You're going to get killings, you're going to get torture, you're going to get disappearances, you might get religion, you might get free speech, but you won't get housing, you won't get food, you won't get education, and so on, because that's not a real element of the way in which we think about human rights today. And I would suggest that this has been a recipe for failure. In part also, and I don't have time to develop this much, because the ability to appeal to a broader electorate is removed. So we end up saying to the average voter, guess what? We've protected terrorists who would otherwise have been arbitrarily deported. We've protected, and I don't want to diminish the importance of it, a handful of pro-Palestinian activists in the United States from being deported, and so on. Those are very important activities, but they ain't going to get you anywhere with the great majority of voters. Whereas if economic and social rights were a key part of it, if a decent education was guaranteed and not able to be undermined through privatization, if decent healthcare, which doesn't exist in the United States for a large proportion of the population, were guaranteed, suddenly the concept of human rights would have a more obvious appeal to a much broader constituency. But that's been eliminated by the way in which we interpret it. Okay, I'm going to have to move faster so that I don't run out of time before you all fall asleep. Just one thing, I've known this for a long time and I even have used it in a lot of my teaching, but I recently listened to a new book on Martin Luther King, which makes use of a lot more historical materials and so on. But the most important part of that book was simply to remind us all that in his final years, King decided that the focus on civil rights was entirely inadequate, that it wasn't going to liberate Black people in the United States if they got the right to vote or the right to free speech. They had to have economic rights. And he launched the Poor People's Campaign, which was focused entirely on economic rights. And it's possibly no coincidence that he was assassinated before his great march on Washington to demand economic rights could take place. And I think we are very much in that same situation today, where we are fighting for a very inadequate conception which will not bring freedom in any real sense to the majority of people in the world. Okay, let me move on and move more quickly. The second point is to return to and highlight foundational values underlying human rights. we have disaggregated rights so that we talk about the right. Non-discrimination is one of the classic examples. You cannot treat this person this way on the basis of their race or their gender or whatever. You cannot imprison someone arbitrarily, but we don't talk about deeper values. They are not part of the real equation. And I'm not even talking about the economic counterparts that I would think are important, like economic security, economic and social dignity, human flourishing, well-being, and so on. But we don't put human rights discourse on a solid foundation in terms of human dignity, freedom in its fullest sense, solidarity, compassion, caring, and so on. That campaign for broader values has been lost. And the irony is that we should have been taught a lesson by the Heritage Foundation. The 900 pages of the Heritage Foundation's agenda, which is now being implemented furiously, is based on values. And it says in the introduction, we need to cut through superficial distractions and focus on the moral and foundational challenges America faces. And we need to enable the president to operate with strategic clarity. And of course, the values restore the family as the centerpiece of American life. Now that's code for all sorts of radical backsliding on a range of issues. Dismantle the administrative state and return self-governance to the American people. I'm going to return self-governance to Yulia now. You're on your own, honey. We've got nothing to do with you. All up to you. Good luck. Out of here. That's the notion of self-governance that is implicit in this. But it's an appeal to values. It's an appeal that the conservatives have championed. Defend our nation's sovereignty, borders, and bounty against global threats. And finally, secure our God-given individual rights to live freely. What's the equivalent on the other side? Don't torture people. Don't use capital punishment. Don't return refugees without doing whatever. And a whole list of very worthy objectives, all of which are rights and all of which are important, but don't capture anything in terms of the deeper values. You know, so if you're concerned about European responses to migration, obviously one can talk about this is no way to treat, you know, a black person. This is no way to treat someone who is in distress. Or you can talk about this is not the Europe that we are standing for. The fundamental values are those of compassion, of solidarity, of engagement with a wider world. That's got to be underpinning, and I think we've completely lost that. Third, and this is a much bigger topic than I have time to justify here, we need to move beyond what I call legalism, shaming, and criminalization. Those are the three main techniques used by the human rights movement. Legalism, yes, it's important, but if you think that the world is a courtroom and that everyone's going to respond to sort of legalistic argument, you don't understand very much. If you still think, and Ken Roth, who headed Human Rights Watch for 30 years, has just produced his memoirs and he's doing a tour all around the world to say, I was right to focus everything we do on naming and shaming governments. Naming and shaming doesn't get you very far at all. It got him somewhere because he had the US executive or the Congress behind him to threaten various states. Now that that is completely out of the equation, shaming without being able to appeal to a major constituency in the relevant country is going to be ever more ineffectual, in my view. I was very often asked at press conferences when I was special rapporteur, what effect do you think your report's going to have on the situation in my country? You've said a lot of very negative things and so on. Do you think the government's going to listen to you? And my answer was, of course not. Are you mad? No government is going to listen to someone saying your human rights record is bad. No one, least of all my own government, the Australian one. The only impact that human rights discourse is going to have is if it resonates with the relevant population. If they say, yeah, that person's right, actually, it's true that we are not doing things the way we should. And if that then generates some sort of movement at the national level, but this high level abstracted, I'm going to shame Xi Jinping, who's going to suddenly say, oh my God, this is so embarrassing, I'm going to change policy overnight, is ludicrous. And the other element that I've written about elsewhere is criminalization, that we tend to think these days that where there is a serious situation, the best approach is to make it criminal, to indict someone for crimes against humanity or genocide or whatever. All that's very important, but it shouldn't become the tail that wags the dog, as we say in English. And I think it's we're at risk of doing that. Okay, so moving on quickly, number 4, the human rights movement needs to engage much more with cultural dimensions, techniques, and so on, and to work through local groups in ways that it has not done in the past. I edited a volume of essays last year on the complexity of human rights, and that makes the argument there. I won't go over it here. 5th, and this is implicit in a lot of what I've said, and I talked about it this morning with a small group of Max Weber Fellows, is the human rights community needs to engage with the political economy of human rights. So far, most human rights groups say, oh, that's a question of finances, of taxes, or whatever. We don't deal with that. That's someone else. And in fact, most of the most important human rights policies are underpinned by or undermined by fiscal policy, in fact. It's the way in which governments choose to reward or punish certain activities, which has a huge impact on human rights outcomes, but most human rights groups do not engage with those issues. And finally, number 6 is to revive the forgotten art of mobilization. Human rights have never been recognized or respected by governments spontaneously or altruistically. Human rights must be demanded. They must be extracted from governments. And yet, the human rights movement today ignores this need for mobilization and thinks that it can just generate reports that are highly critical and leave it at that. There's many forms of mobilization. I don't want to be mistaken for suggesting that we need mass protests as the only way forward, although those might be important. And God bless the people in Istanbul who are currently engaging in those mass protests. But that's only one form of mobilization. I came across a lovely book in the EUI library called, well, it's not called this, but it's, well, maybe, it's about artivism. In other words, it combines artistic expressions and so on with activism. And it highlights or it outlines the many ways in which artists of all descriptions can pursue advocacy through their work, and that can have enormous impacts. But again, the human rights movement, composed largely of lawyers, very narrowly focused, very Western-oriented, has not seen it as one of its major responsibilities to reach out to these broader constituencies, try to encourage them to facilitate what they're doing, and so on. The final point I'd make, I just want to conclude at a time of what is inevitably great frustration and disillusionment to indicate what I think are the major successes of the human rights movement over the last 75 years or so. And this is without getting into any fine detail at all. For me, the major successes are actually women's rights, children's rights, Indigenous people's rights, rights of people with disability. In all of those areas, the human rights regime has been a pioneering force and a legitimizing force to reinforce local movements, to reflect back the achievements that they've made in international treaties, international standards. And those different movements, yes, there's a big backlash against all of them probably, but they have made huge progress. You know, the difference in the situation of women from when I was a kid, in terms of my mother's generation, is unimaginable, probably to most of you, really unimaginable. The same with children, the way in which they're seen, the same with people with disabilities, and the same with Indigenous groups, all absolutely transformed. But the key characteristics are that it hasn't been an obsessive focus on the rights of individuals. It's been more of a collective movement. Economic and social rights dimensions have been important in regard to all of them, and therefore helped with mobilization. And finally, you have a real appeal to values. It's not just a demand by women for one particular thing, it's a demand for respect. It's a demand for dignity for women as a whole across the board. And that has much more salience than saying that you must, I don't know what the goal is, you must promote more women, you know, in corporations, or you must have better prison facilities for women or whatever. But the deeper value movement is what contributes, I think, to the success of a lot of those initiatives in those different areas. I'll leave it at that. Sorry to have covered so much ground or to have talked for so long.